They were born into tragedy long before they took their first breath. Two souls bound not by love, but by blood, tangled in a lineage that should have ended generations before. Their faces told a story their family refused to speak. Eyes too close, features too alike, whispers too loud for the silence they lived in. Locals called them the cursed pair, though no one dared say it to their faces. Because in that quiet town, everyone knew the blood that ran through their veins was older than sin and darker than the soil beneath their feet. You've probably never heard their names. You weren't supposed to. Their family wasn't written in history books. Their story was buried, sealed away by church records, burned photographs, and unmarked graves. But beneath it all lies a truth that chills the spine of American history. A truth about what happens when generations of secrecy collapse on themselves, when love becomes indistinguishable from bloodline, and survival becomes a form of punishment. What I'm about to tell you isn't folklore, it isn't rumor. It's documented, though rarely spoken aloud. This is the story of the most inbred couple in U.S. history. Two people who were never meant to exist, born from generations of silence, obsession, and denial. It began, like most tragedies, with pride, the kind of pride that rots from the inside out. Families that believed they were chosen, pure, untouched by the outside world. In a forgotten corner of Appalachia, isolation wasn't a curse. It was a tradition. Marriages between cousins, siblings, even closer ties whispered behind locked doors. The family's name became a riddle erased from public records, replaced with initials and half-truths. But what they left behind tells its own story. Photographs where everyone looks the same, documents that contradict themselves, and a trail of medical anomalies that no doctor could explain. And at the center of it all, two people. A man and a woman who believed they were in love, though their love was the final echo of a bloodline collapsing in on itself. Their union would become the breaking point, the last chapter of a century-long curse that no one dared speak of again. This isn't just about them. It's about what happens when a family decides to play God and loses everything human in the process. Long before the couple was born, their family had already become an island, a name whispered with unease in nearby towns, but never spoken directly. They lived in a hollow deep in the Appalachian mountains, where the roads ended and the map turned blank. Outsiders didn't go there. Those who did never went twice. The family called themselves keepers of the land, claiming descent from pioneers who carved their home out of wilderness. But isolation became their only inheritance. Generations passed, and the family tree stopped branching outward. Instead, it began curling in on itself, roots strangling roots. It started innocently enough. Cousins marrying cousins. Familiar faces felt safer than strangers. But over time, familiarity turned into confinement. There were fewer new faces, fewer choices, and eventually, no escape at all. The children born from those unions carried the weight of every decision their ancestors refused to face. Some were born frail, some deformed, some simply different. The town doctor stopped visiting. The preacher stopped coming up the hill. And soon, the family stopped inviting anyone in. They built their own world, one where truth was rewritten, and the meaning of family became distorted beyond recognition. The men worked the same soil their grandfathers had, the women birthed children who looked too much like their uncles, and the older generation kept the records hidden in a locked chest. To them, it wasn't wrong, it was survival. A closed circle of blood that they believed protected them from corruption, disease, outsiders. They didn't realize the disease was already inside. By the early 1900s, their name was gone from public census records. Local officials described them only as the Mountain Family. Their cabin walls were lined with fading portraits, each face more similar than the last. Same pale eyes, same flattened noses, same haunting expression, as if each generation carried the same ghost inside. And then came the last pair, the final link in a chain of silence. They were born to siblings, raised to believe they were cousins, and promised to each other before they were old enough to understand what love was. Their families saw it as destiny. The rest of the world would one day see it as horror. The year was 1941, and the birth of this couple would mark the end of the line, a bloodline too pure for its own survival. Their names were Ruth and Eerie, born less than a year apart, in the same one-room shack that had housed their family for generations. The midwife, an old woman from a neighboring town, stopped coming after Ruth's birth. She'd whispered that something about the baby wasn't right, that the child's features were too familiar. Her eyes a strange pale gray that didn't catch the light. But in the hollow, no one spoke of such things. Ruth grew up quiet, obedient, and withdrawn. She'd sit for hours on the porch, tracing patterns in the dirt with a stick, humming songs no one else knew. Eli was different, restless, defiant, with a strength that made him both feared and admired among the few other children who lived nearby. He didn't speak much, but when he did, it was usually to defend Ruth. They were inseparable, two halves of the same story. The elders said it was natural. They'd been raised together since birth, after all. But to the few outsiders who crossed their path, there was something unsettling about how they looked at each other. When they turned 13, the family's matriarch, their grandmother, known only as Ma Lu, began preparing them for what she called the keeping. It was the ritual that had bound generations before them, a twisted version of marriage disguised as tradition. Ma Lu told them it was their duty to preserve the family's bloodline. She said the world beyond the mountain was full of sin and weakness, that only their kind were untainted. The truth, of course, was much darker. By then, years of genetic collapse had taken their toll. Some children were born unable to walk, others without speech, and some, like Eerie, with strange fits of rage that no one could explain. The family called it the fever, but it wasn't illness. It was the echo of centuries of inbreeding, surfacing in body and mind. As Ruth and Eerie grew, so did the whispers. Neighbors in the valley spoke of screams in the night, of figures wandering the woods barefoot, of animals found mutilated near the creek. Whether those stories were true or born from fear, no one knows. But something in that hollow had changed. The air grew heavier, the silence deeper, and Ruth began dreaming of a world beyond the ridge, a world where faces didn't all look the same. But in that family, dreams were dangerous, and Ruth's dreams would soon become the reason everything came undone. The summer Ruth turned 16, the hollow fell silent. No music, no laughter, no sign of the few families that still lingered nearby. The cornfields lay unharvested, the air thick with heat and dread. That was the year Ma Lu declared the bloodline must be sealed. The ceremony would take place at dusk, with the family gathered beneath the sycamore tree, the same place where every generation had been joined before. Ruth didn't understand what was coming until the night before. She overheard Ma Lu whispering to her father, her mother, both of them pale, trembling, resigned. "It's God's will," the old woman said. They were chosen. But Ruth wasn't chosen. She was cornered. When Eerie came to her that night, his eyes were wild and glistening in the candlelight. He didn't speak. He just placed his hand on hers and said, "They won't let us go." The next evening, the family gathered. The men in their tattered shirts, the women with ribbons tied in their hair, as if this were some kind of celebration. Ruth stood in a white dress that had belonged to her mother. Eerie beside her, solemn, silent. The preacher, a cousin by blood, mumbled the same verses he had used for decades. But his words felt hollow, like an echo bouncing off the mountains. When the vows were spoken, Ruth could feel the earth tilt. It wasn't love she felt. It was a kind of quiet terror, a knowing that what she was becoming part of could never be undone. The moment the ceremony ended, the family cheered. Ma Lu wept, muttering about purity, about destiny, about keeping the blood unbroken. But in Ruth's chest, something had already shattered. The days that followed were worse than she imagined. The house grew suffocating. The walls whispered with the weight of generations watching. Eerie changed. His temper flared more often, his eyes distant, his mind unraveling in ways she couldn't understand. Sometimes he'd speak in fragments, about voices in the woods, about children crying who weren't there. Other times he'd vanish for hours, returning with blood on his hands, unable to explain why. Ruth tried to run once, made it halfway down the hill before her father caught her. He didn't scold her. He only said, "There's nowhere else for us." And deep down, Ruth knew he was right. No one in the valley would take her. No one would believe her. The world outside didn't even know she existed. So she stayed, and the hollow kept its silence, until the night Ellie stopped coming home. It began with a sound, a single, distant cry echoing through the trees. Ruth woke in the dark, the cabin cold, Ellie's side of the bed empty. The door was open, swaying gently in the wind. Outside, the night was thick and alive, the woods whispering with the low hum of insects and something else, something she couldn't name. She lit a lantern and stepped out barefoot into the dirt. The path to the creek was lined with half-buried bones. Animal, maybe or maybe not. She called his name, once, twice, no answer. Just the endless rustle of leaves. By morning, Eli was gone. No footprints, no blood, nothing but silence. The family gathered, eyes wide with something between fear and denial. Malou said it was God's punishment, that the blood had grown too thin, the line too fragile. Ruth said nothing. Deep down, she knew Eli hadn't been taken. He had gone. Days turned to weeks. The air changed. Food spoiled faster. Animals refused to come near the house. Ruth stopped eating. She'd sit by the window, staring at the tree where she'd once been bound, waiting for the shape of him to return from the woods. Some nights, she swore she heard him. Soft footsteps circling the cabin, whispering her name in a voice that wasn't human anymore. The others began disappearing soon after. First Malou, then Ruth's father. The hollow was unraveling piece by piece. A traveling trader passing through months later found the cabins empty, doors open, fire pits cold. He told the sheriff he'd seen strange symbols carved into the trees. Circles within circles, like the family was marking its own extinction. Years later, hikers stumbled upon the ruins. They found remnants, broken dishes, rusted tools, fragments of a photograph showing two figures, blurred and too close together to tell apart. Locals said the land was cursed. They said the soil still breathed, that nothing would grow there. And somewhere in that forgotten valley, a single cabin still stands. Inside, on the wall above a broken bed frame, are two names scratched into the wood: Ruth Hussey Lee. Forever pure. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments. What would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you have stayed, or tried to escape the curse that raised you? Because some bloodlines don't end when the people do. They linger, in stories, in whispers, in the faces of strangers who look a little too familiar. Decades passed before anyone dared to speak their names again. The hollow was reclaimed by forest. The cabins rotted into the earth, and the road leading there was swallowed by vines. But in the county courthouse, buried beneath water, damaged archives and brittle birth certificates, someone found them. The records, the proof. A chain of names so tightly wound together it was hard to tell where one generation ended and the next began. What they discovered was horrifying. For over 100 years, the same surnames repeated again and again. Brothers marrying sisters, fathers marrying daughters, children registered as both niece and cousin to the same man. The documents were half burned, the handwriting frantic, as if the record keeper had tried to erase his own guilt. Among the names, two appeared at the very end: Ruth Ann and Ely Thomas. Their marriage listed without witnesses, their deaths unrecorded. The line ended there, but even the dead leave traces. Local doctors in the 1950s noted cases of strange congenital deformities in the region: brittle bones, fused joints, speech defects. When questioned, the families often said the same thing: "We don't talk about them." One physician later admitted that every time he drove through that valley, he'd feel the hair rise on his neck. "You could tell," he said. "The blood ran too close there, like the past was still alive." The newspapers avoided the story. It was too grim, too shameful. In post-war America, people wanted optimism, not horror. But the truth never disappears. It just waits. In local folklore, Ruth and Eli became ghosts, lovers doomed to haunt the hollow forever, still walking hand in hand under a harvest moon. But historians digging deeper saw it differently. They saw a mirror of America's hidden sins: isolation, pride, and the desperate human need to belong, even when it destroys us. Some say Ruth did survive, that she wandered into town one winter morning, barefoot and half-mad, carrying something wrapped in cloth. A child, maybe. No one knows for sure. The sheriff's report mentions only a girl with gray eyes who would not speak. She was sent to an asylum 2 counties over. No name, no records after that. And yet, every few years, someone claims to see a woman on that road at dusk, pale, barefoot, humming a song no one recognizes. The wind carries it down the valley, soft and mournful. A lullaby for a bloodline that refused to die quietly. They say history forgets what it cannot forgive, but some stories refuse to stay buried. The tale of Ruth and Eli, what they were born from, what they became, still lingers like a stain that won't wash out. Every generation leaves behind its ghosts, but this one left its DNA. When genealogists began tracing Appalachian family lines in the late 20th century, they found threads that led nowhere, and others that led directly back to the hollow. Hidden descendants, changed names, families that had moved hundreds of miles away but still bore the same mutations, the same gray eyes. No one wanted to admit it, but the past was still walking among them. The bloodline hadn't vanished. It had only scattered. In some versions of the story, Ruth's child survived. They say a traveling minister took the baby and raised it in another state, changing its name to bury the shame. Others insist Ruth herself lived in the asylum until the 1960s, sitting by her window every night, whispering to someone who wasn't there. When she died, nurses claimed her final words were, "He's waiting under the tree." Even now, hikers speak of strange sounds in the valley. Voices carried on the wind, the faint melody of a woman humming. Locals avoid the place. They call it the Pure Hollow, though no one remembers why. Hunters swear that animals refuse to cross its borders, and that the soil, when disturbed, still smells faintly of iron. But the real horror isn't in the ghosts, it's in the truth. Because the story of Ruth and Eerie isn't just a nightmare tucked away in one forgotten corner of America. It's a reflection of what happens when pride outweighs morality, when blood becomes an idol, when family turns inward until there's nowhere left to go. Some families leave behind wealth, others leave behind legends. This one left a warning that purity is a lie, that isolation is death, distant hill, and that love, twisted by fear, can become something unrecognizable. So the next time you see two old gravestones side by side beneath an unmarked sycamore, remember them. Ruth and Eerie, the most inbred couple in U.S. history, born into tragedy, consumed by silence, and remembered only by the whispers of the trees that watched them die. And if you ever find yourself walking that lonely path through the mountains, listen closely. If you hear humming in the dark, don't follow it. Some bloodlines are better left forgotten.